Digital Afterlife of Grief. I am Ginger Lou, and today I am going to talk a little bit about grief technology from photography to AI, the link between Victorian portraiture in the 19th century and AI death tech in the 21st century. Interactive internet-based technologies are transforming how we understand death, grieving and coping with loss. The societal lockdown during COVID-19 produced a radical shift in communication that affected traditional death rituals. Saying goodbye to and remembering the recently deceased was conducted on online video streaming platforms. I have a personal experience with this because my 99-year-old aunt died in Southern California, and she had her wake via Zoom. So not at the funeral, but the actual wake. So it was a chat between the family, who are spread out all over the world, across America, the UK and elsewhere. So it was actually a real nice experience, because without that, I should say, there would have been no wake for us to attend to. So it was a really good experience. Better to have that than not, for sure. Startups working in the death tech or grief tech industry have designed different approaches that enable users to communicate with the dead via text, video, audio, or photorealistic avatars. The technology represents a recent shift from photography to artificial intelligence as a tool for remembering the deceased. Several death tech companies have claimed that AI technology can create the essence of a person. For the first time, the deceased can communicate with the living via a chatbot or grief bot or animated avatar. In 2016, James Vlahos created an AI chatbot from conversations with his late father. In 2019, he founded Hereafter AI, a web application that, according to his website, helps, and I quote, preserve meaningful memories about your life and interactively share them with people you love. In 2020, You Only Virtual designed a platform where users could create individual virtual personas of deceased, called Versonas. The platform claims to recreate, and I quote, the unique dynamics of a relationship and generate an authentic essence, or Versona, so that one can continue to share precious moments with a loved one even after physical death. End quote. You notice the term essence is being used. In 2021, Microsoft patented a conversational chatbot designed after a real person to allow users to have virtual conversations with the deceased. In the same year, AI death tech company DID created deep nostalgia for the online genealogy platform MyHeritage. The app created animated video loops from still photographs of the deceased and was a global phenomenon with more than 100 million users in its first year of release. In 2022, conversational AI company Storyfile presented an interactive AI video at the funeral of the founder's deceased mother. The company states on its website that users can, I quote, make your experiences and your essence permanent. Our technology allows you to make connections and impact lives even after you're gone, end quote. Notice again the term essence. The more we interact with technology, the more our digital selves evolve into realistic representations. The recent growth in the AI death tech industry, where posthumous digital images and messages make the reanimation of the dead by the AI the norm, is reconstructing the essence of humanity, creating perhaps a new essence. But any of these claims by big tech are genuine, or does the familiarity of the term that is borrowed from photography, i.e. essence, is it a catch-all phrase to sell a product? Heaven forbid. Post-mortem portrait. Since its invention in the 19th century, portrait photography has been a medium that captures a person's likeness or physical appearance. However, the concept of essence in portrait photography adds more meaning to the image. The photographer aims to capture something intangible that goes beyond the subject's physical appearance, revealing their unique character, personality, and identity. Photography is also associated with death, influencing how people remember and mourn the dead. In an era of high mortality rates in Victorian Britain and during the American Civil War, and the absence of commissioned photographs during a loved one's lifetime, a post-mortem photograph was proof of their existence and helped keep the deceased memory alive. Portrait commissions were influenced by the appearance of the deceased, and survivors drew comfort from their peaceful exteriors. Post-mortem portraits could provide comfort and help survivors reflect on their loss. The post-mortem portrait was a memory image and provided proof that death had happened. And I quote, "Photographs are relics, material objects of the deceased, and connect the dead with the living," according to Barthes. Photography facilitated communication between the living and the dead that was linked with religion and the idea of an afterlife. The Christian faith was a major influence on people's lives in the 19th century. Mortality rates were high, death was part of life, the body was important in religious terms as an instrument of heavenly virtue. The self fragmented temporality into spirit and matter, and, according to Christian beliefs, Jesus Christ's immortal soul would be reunited with the resurrected body. Physical remains were thought to continue a bodily existence beyond the grave and were treated with reverence and respect by the bereaved before disposal. Within the context of Christian beliefs, the dead body could be viewed as precious and beautiful. And I quote, "a worthy recipient of tender loving care and a subject of memorialization by the camera." Audrey Linkman. The post-mortem portrait filled a desire to see and remember the person in death. Other reasons for the commission of post-mortem portraits are related to absent family and friends. Rituals surrounding death meant that the bereaved felt an obligation or duty towards the dead. Protestants believed in a good death and should occur in the home, surrounded by family, confident that they would meet again in heaven. For families who couldn't attend the bedside due to work, illness, or immigration, perhaps a post-mortem photograph provided consolation. With the invention of the carte viste, portraits were given to family and friends who were not present at the funeral. In the 1870s, retouching was widely practiced in portrait photography. Photographers worked on glass negatives with a retouching medium, lead pencils and sharp knives to enhance the image of the dead. A bit like Photoshop, except old school Photoshop. Eyes were drawn on eyelids to give the impression of the dead at rest or asleep. In the second half of the 19th century, profound changes overtook death practices as mortality rates declined and Christian beliefs in the afterlife waned. The development of a new style of post-mortem portrait began in North America in the 1880s, which replaced traditional mourning rituals from coffins to caskets. Caskets held precious objects and were padded for comfort, larger than the traditional coffin, and made in different colours or materials like metal or glass, if you could afford it, of course. Caskets were a barometer of a family's wealth, and a post-mortem portrait could promote the family's stature. Changes in how the dead body was cared for and disposed moved from family home to funeral parlours and the cemetery. Funeral directors now control the scents and events of the last memory pictures. Post-mortem portraits lost their meaning, while the living distanced themselves from the dead and disengaged from the disposal of the body meant that the death became something to be feared. Paying the last respite in the home gradually died out, and death ceased to share the spaces occupied by the living. In the 1870s, the physical body came to be regarded by some as the vacated tenement, disposable and essential in comparison to the soul. The bereaved ceased to revere the corpse and concentrated on the eternal spirit of the individual. William Mumler's 1872 portrait of Marie Todd Lincoln sitting in front of the image of the late President Lincoln possessed a spiritual or magical quality that gave it a sense of presence. And I quote, "as if it were less an image or likeness than the image itself, the very identity of the sitter," end quote, perhaps the essence. Not understanding the technology of the time, the Victorians believed that ghosts could be captured in a photograph and that the image was a conduit to the afterlife. Spirit photos marked a shift in faith or a belief in a man's ability to reveal the nature and workings of the divine in a technology's ability to enhance man's power or perceptions. Spiritual photos eased people's fear of death by emphasizing the individual of the soul and supporting the links between the physical and the spiritual realms. Now, before you stop laughing at the Victorians for being duped into these viewing these spiritual photos as real, how many of us have been duped when we watch deep fake videos and AI altered, even Photoshop altered photographs, okay? We've all been duped and we all do it. Photography facilitated communication between the living and the dead, which was linked with Christianity and the idea of the afterlife. Matthews describes the photograph as, and I quote, windows through which survivors can use their imagination to communicate with the spirit world of the dead, end quote. Does this have any familiarity with AI? I hear you ask. Post-mortem portraits fell out of trend by the middle and the upper classes, but the working classes, looking to emulate those above, continued the practice into the 20th century. In the early 20th century, post-mortem portraits declined in popularity in North America and Europe, assisted by the considerable losses of the two world wars, and ideas and beliefs about the nature of the self changed. In the absence of any sympathetic understanding of the experiences, attitudes, values, and religious practices of previous generations, post-mortem portraits were considered macabre, and photos were probably thrown away. Immigrants kept up the tradition of post-mortem portraits and sent photographs home as a connection to the old country to maintain family bonds. And by the way, post-mortem photographs continue today for those who've lost a child. That is a service that goes on today to preserve a portrait of a lost child. Essence in portraiture. Julian Margaret Cameron's 19th century daguerre-type portraits were influenced by Christian beliefs and aesthetics. Her images of important men and women posed in religious scenes were often captured out of sharp focus or to convey a spiritual aesthetic, an intimate act of communication between one soul and another. And I quote, recording faithfully the greatness of the inner as well as the features of the outer man, end quote. Cameron aimed to capture the sitter's likeness, and I quote, as by which the qualities of the inner soul were manifest in the portrait, end quote. Does that sound like Essence? It very much sounds like Essence to me. Lavater saw the link between the inner and the outer state and selfhood as an aesthetic, ontological relation and construction based on techniques of the self. He saw the construction of the self through an interpretation of the relationship of the self with others and believed that the self does not exist in isolation but with others and is constructed with the participation of the viewer. Photography then is a representational device and the act of photography in the relationship between the self and the viewer. Looking at AI death tech platforms in context with Victorian postmodern photography and attaining the sitter's essence in portraiture, we can see a link between technology, consumerism, and society's view on death and bereavement. So what I'm trying to say is that how we deal with death, bereavement, grief, loss, that doesn't change. But the technology we use to transfer the image of the dead, to remember the image of the dead, to remember them, memorialize them, the technology changes. But how we deal with it remains the same. But now we have, things can go off the rails a bit, I think, now, because now we have the opportunity with AI to have a proper two-way communication with the dead, because they can talk back to us. We can chat to them on chatbots. We can talk to them in avatars. And this is only the beginning of the technology. So how is that going to affect grief? Will it not prolong grief? Isn't it just the case that we need to spend some time getting over the deceased? Or is it a useful support technology that will help us and guide us through bereavement? Because bereavement, grief, is a very isolating emotion. We might have family around us, but we all suffer alone and in silence. We're told throughout the 20th century that when someone dies, we must get over it, not talk about it, and just move on. And things are changing now. Things are perhaps linking again between the 21st centuries and the Victorian era of the 19th century, where death was not hidden away. death was worn in fashion. Women wore black, men wore, ribbons in their hats. It was not hidden away. The family came round, the extended family. So perhaps we're having a little bit of a return to that because we haven't coped with 20th century grieving processes of, well, get over it, go back to work 3 days after your mother dies, go on, you can do it, get over it. We've not coped with that. And I think social media has been a barometer of that because of the Facebook groups, memorial groups, grieving groups that have gone on through Facebook over the 10, 15, perhaps 20 years that Facebook has been around. And now that we're onto a new technology where we can share our griefs, we can share our experiences. So perhaps this is a good thing. But let's see, we're at the beginning of everything. And it's still a lot of stuff to discuss. Thanks for listening. Take care of yourself. I'll be back soon.